So now that we've examined international governmental organizations and the ways in which states come together to collectively solve common problems, let's take a look at non-governmental organizations and the ways that individuals and collections of individuals can come together and solve global problems. So non-governmental organizations and the ways in which they network together do make a difference in the global community. There are tens of thousands of these organizations, maybe even more, throughout the global community that are concerned about all kinds of issues, individual issues, or anything as broad as human security to specific issues like, let's say, landmines. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But these types of organizations are a part of what we might call global civil society, a global citizenry that bands together as non-governmental entities to solve common problems. So how and why do these types of organizations, non-governmental organizations, even come about in today's global community? Now, these aren't new organizations. We've seen non-governmental organizations emerge for quite some time. But really, in the last 20 or so years, we've seen a huge leap forward in the amount of activity among non-governmental organizations. This, of course, is largely due to the internet and the ease with which we can now share information and, of course, travel around the world to see things firsthand. We can see problems firsthand. So as more and more global citizens have traveled around the world and noticed problems that they are concerned about, they reach out to others and they create collectives. They create these organizations that work to try and solve it, either in partnership with governments or perhaps in opposition to governments, depending on the situation and the problem. We call these people social entrepreneurs, people that are very entrepreneurial in nature, but are doing so for a social cause, for a social good. They see some sort of problem and they want to address it, and so they do so by reaching out and asking for others to join with them and come together to try and pressure governments in many different ways, through lobbies, through writing letters, through protests even. There are lots of different ways in which non-governmental organizations can actually make a difference. We'll talk about that in a minute. But these non-governmental organizations have grown in number, in scale, and importance as more and more global citizens are traveling the world and communicating with one another easily every day. So let's talk a little bit about specifically what these non-governmental organizations do, and particularly when non-governmental organizations, different organizations, come together in a network to solve a particular problem. First of all, these organizations, it's critical that they raise awareness about the problem that they see, that the issue that they're concerned about, that they raise awareness and make sure that people are knowledgeable about a human rights crisis or some sort of environmental concern or health epidemic or whatever it is. They're raising awareness about that issue. In order to raise awareness, they're using stories, personal stories usually, of people that have been affected by certain cases. So let's go back to this issue of landmines and an organization called the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. They would tell stories about landmine survivors and how those survivors and those interested in trying to prevent future landmine injuries would come together, network together in various organizations, working hand in hand, like with the Red Cross or Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, working together in a network to raise awareness about this particular issue. People being injured by landmines years after war is over, years after landmines have actually been placed in the ground. So this is an excellent example of how an organization works together, how individuals work together collectively in an organization, in a network, in order to raise awareness and use stories, personal stories, that will create a sense of urgency about that particular issue. Non-governmental organizations and networks also leverage celebrity, let's say. They'll use powerful individuals to tell their stories as well. So in the case of landmines, if you remember Princess Diana, she was an advocate for demining. And so they would use her or leverage her celebrity and her power, her public persona, to raise awareness about this issue. Today, other individuals, such as Al Gore, for example, are interested in environmental concerns and are using their power and celebrity to try and raise awareness and tell the stories about why we should address environmental concerns. So they raise awareness, they tell stories, they leverage power and celebrity, and finally, non-governmental organizations and networks work together to hold governments and states accountable. They hold them accountable for what they say they're going to do. They take a look at what governments have signed in terms of treaties and regulations and laws, and they hold them accountable. They raise awareness about governments and whether they're complying with those laws and regulations that they have signed on to. Or they work in collaboration with governments to raise awareness about other troubling governments. But they are focused on accountability and making sure that people do what they say they're going to do, that states and governments do what they say they're going to do. So raising awareness, telling the stories of those people that are affected, using power and celebrity to their advantage, and holding others accountable are important aspects of what non-governmental organizations and transnational networks do on a daily basis. Now, how do these tactics make a difference? First of all, non-governmental organizations and transnational networks in engaging in this kind of work help affect agendas. They help governments to get these issues on an agenda. The International Campaign to Ban Landmines worked very hard to get the landmine issue on the agenda for governments at the UN and at other organizations. It was very difficult, and so they ultimately ended up bringing states together outside of a formal and official structure in order to make progress in that issue area. But if there had been no International Campaign to Ban Landmines, there wouldn't be a landmine ban today, because they got that issue on the agenda. Secondly, non-governmental organizations and transnational networks help to affect the positions that governments take on these certain issues and the ways in which they discuss it. So first they get it on the agenda, and then they have an impact on their positions and how this issue is discussed within the policymaking community. These organizations also affect policies, not just getting things on the agenda and not just affecting the way people talk about it and what they say about these issues, but actually creating policies and treaties and documents that prescribe certain state behavior. They affect behavior. Once you've raised awareness about this issue, you've gotten it on the agenda, you've affected the way people talk about it, you've gotten them to create a policy, then you have to actually help them implement it and make sure that they're complying with the policies that they've created. So all of these things are ways in which non-governmental organizations and transnational networks actually make a difference. Once they've raised awareness, they've told the stories, they're working to hold people accountable by doing all of these things, setting agendas and affecting the way people talk about things and ultimately the way they behave. Now, to be sure, some of these types of organizations are more successful than others. I mentioned the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, and other organizations like the Cluster Munitions Coalition were successful in getting states to sign a treaty and actually ban things like anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions. Other types of organizations, environmental organizations, for example, have perhaps struggled a little bit more. And there's one particular reason why, according to research, that the more these types of organizations focus on what we call bodily harm or issues focusing on human security, the more successful they might be. But regardless, these non-governmental organizations and these transnational networks are major players in the global community. Regardless of how successful they are, they're here to stay. They're here to work with states, in opposition to states, and they clearly do make a difference in the global community.